Welcome back to Fuel Up Classic. Now, if you haven't subscribed already, please do. It makes all the difference. And a huge thank you to each and every one of you who've already commented, subscribed, and liked my other classic car videos. There's plenty more on the way, so please do subscribe if you haven't already. And the subject of today's video is something that comes up from time to time. And I've been involved with classic cars my entire life, and I've known so many people that will instantly not consider a car because of its mileage. And I don't always understand why that's the case. And to try and sort of debunk some of the myths around high mileage classic cars, I've assembled a trio of classic cars behind me, all of which have covered well in excess of 100,000 miles. We'll look at each car individually, but also just discuss the wider area of why it might actually be a wise decision to at least consider a high mileage classic, and also why mileage doesn't really matter overall when you compare it to the many other factors that you should be looking at when you're buying a classic car. So join me in this video and we'll explore whether mileage is important or not when you're purchasing your next classic car. So I think to kick things off, let's actually try and understand what high mileage means when you're talking about a classic car, because it may mean a very different number to you depending on where you're watching this in the world. If you're watching this in Australia, for example, it's very normal that a car may have covered hundreds of thousands of miles, or in the United States, for obvious reasons, great vast distances, and you cover big mileage in a car. But here in Europe and here in the UK in particular, we still seem to be a little bit hung up on high mileage cars. We're very quick to dismiss them, and there seems to be this psychological barrier of about 100,000 miles being considered a high mileage car. And that may have been true 50 years ago, but cars these days and cars for 30 or 40 years have been largely very well engineered, and they can cover big mileage with no real problems. So I've assembled this trio of different classic cars to try and sort of strip away at some of those points. I have bought several high mileage classic cars. Two of them stood right here, both in excess of 100,000 miles, and they've been fantastic fun. I've also learned from my experience, bitter experience, and bought the shiniest, lowest mileage, best looking example, and been bitten very hard when things go wrong. So mileage isn't the be-all and end-all of things. But let's kick things off with the Jaguar XJS, a car that has covered 165,000 miles and is still purring along absolutely wonderfully. Let's take a closer look. So let's have a look at the cold hard facts of this Jaguar XJS. It's an early 1994 car, so it's got the 4-litre straight six engine, probably one of the best engines that Jaguar ever built of the era. It hasn't got the complexity of the big V12 engines, although those V12s are capable of big mileage, but with that becomes high maintenance bills. The actual straight six 3.6 litre and 4 litre variants are really quite solid machines as long as they're properly looked after. And this particular car, I'm certain as we look round it, you would think at first glance, if you didn't know, was a car that perhaps had covered half the miles it really has. It really is that good. Now, the reason that this car, I think, is such a good car, and we really shouldn't look too hard into the mileage, and it goes across the board with buying any type of car, whether it be a classic, whether it be actually something that's relatively modern, but service history, invoices, bills, low ownership as well, they're all really important. Now, buying any old car is always an element of risk and gamble, and as I've said, I've bought the shiniest, loveliest examples and been bitten pretty hard because they're hiding a multitude of sins underneath, or just things go wrong. And now I've just sort of learnt that actually I judge each car on its own merits. I don't care whether a car is high mileage or not. I look for proof of good long-term ownership, proof that this car's been cherished. Now, this car is nearly 30 years old. It's had 3 previous owners, and it did the bulk of its mileage within the first 10 years of ownership. This car was well in excess of 100,000 miles within the first 10 years of being built. And that's where all of these classics would have done the bulk of their mileage, when they were still new cars. But it's been used sensibly for about the last 15 years. It's covered about 50,000 miles in the last 15 years. So sensible, nice mileage, backed up with a huge history file of receipts, invoices, anything it's needed doing has been done. And that is so important. That is more important than looking at mileage and buying a car that's done half the miles, but it's been neglected. That car will bite you much harder than a high mileage car that's been very well looked after. So if you take anything from this video, and I know that I'm just stating the obvious, but I'm asked time and time again whether I'd buy a high mileage car, should I just avoid them? And I always say, if you've got the history to back it up and the car checks out and it looks good, there's very little to be afraid of. So I've driven plenty of XJSs and Jaguar XJs over the years, and as I mentioned in one of my other videos, there's been a Jaguar of some description in my family pretty much consistently since about 1971. So I feel like I'm reasonably well versed when it comes to these. My parents have had them, I've been involved with them, and you may have seen my other video as well on the XJS-C Burberry, a super rare car, one of 2. And that car had done significantly less miles than this. But having said that, I lived with that car for a little while, and I've driven this one around now, and you'd never tell the difference. They're both powered by the straight 6 engine. The Burberry one was actually the smaller 3.6. This is, I think, the pick of the bunch, the 4-litre later model facelifted car. It's the one I would be looking for if I was in the market for an XJS. But this car has, not only does it looks-wise, it wears its miles so well, I just can't tell in the driving experience. It feels just as good as one that had done half the mileage. And that's where, as well, a high mileage classic can also represent great value. And I'll talk about that as well a little bit later. But I'm going to take this car out for a little drive in this video as well, and just sort of show you that it really doesn't feel any different to a car that has done half the mileage or even less. So, we're in a high mileage Jaguar XJS. The internet would lead you to believe that at any moment this car is going to blow up. It's going to break down and leave me stranded. Well, I'm doing 70 miles an hour at the moment down the motorway. I've got perfect oil pressure, perfect engine temperature. The aircon is ice cold, and I'm probably as comfortable as you could ever be in any car. This car has worn its years and miles very, very well, and it's a testament to a very well looked after high mileage car. And that's true across the board. It doesn't matter what type of car it is, that these cars can wear their age and mileage very, very well as long as they're properly looked after. But we'll do the surefire test. We've gone over some bumpy roads. There's no clonking, there's no banging from underneath. A sure sign that all the old suspension bushes are on their way out. But not on this car, because they've been replaced as and when they've needed. And let's not forget, rubber parts perish due to age, not necessarily mileage. So don't fall for the trap that a low-owned car with low mileage that's not been used very often isn't going to be worn out when it comes to all the rubber components, because it probably is. There's no clonking, there's no banging. It shifts through this automatic gearbox seamlessly. The power steering is as light as can be. The brakes are strong and true. They pull you up to a good stop. It's a delight. It's a delight to drive. There's still plenty of performance out of the old 4-litre straight 6. And there's nothing about this car that screams alarm bells to me. It's just a good, fun car to use. There isn't even a significant amount of play in the steering, which is where I would expect a car like this to show its miles, but it doesn't. And I'm not saying that every single car is going to be a good one, whether it's done high mileage. That's simply not the case. But as always, I try and show the very best examples on the channel. It works as a benchmark, and I think this XJS is just a lovely, lovely place to be. We won't go into too much detail. I have done another XJS video on the Burberry car, so check that one out if you just want to know a little bit more about Jaguars in general. Or I've done a Daimler 66, which is a similar sort of Jaguar Daimler of the era, but it has the big V12. So you can check those out if you're interested in, but this is just to take it out for a drive to show you that there's nothing to be feared about a high mileage classic car, even a Jaguar. And that takes me on to the Marcos Mantara. Now this is a car that I've featured a lot on the channel, and you're going to be seeing a lot more of it. We've just come back from a 2,000-mile road trip in France in this car, and it also sort of shows that perhaps you might expect that a big GT car like the Jag, well, so be it. That's a car that's capable of big mileage. But you might not think that a car like this, which is uber rare, there's probably only about 2 or 3 for sale currently in the UK, and I'm probably going to go out on a limb here and say that this is probably the highest mileage Marcos Mantara in the world. I might be wrong, but as it stands and it sits here, it's done 102,000 miles. But again, you'd never know it. Also, the first owner of this car used it every single day for a number of years. It racked up all of its miles, pretty much 95% of its current mileage, in the first few years of ownership. The guy loved it and drove it absolutely everywhere. And I applaud that, because that's what having a car like this is all about. And it now means that this car's approaching 102,000 miles. I have a history file on this car that is that thick. It has been meticulously looked after. And I'd rather buy this car all over again than another example that had done a quarter of the mileage, had no service history, had sat around for years on end, because that's when you get problems with cars, when they're not used and they're not looked after and they're not maintained regularly. This car has been, and it hasn't covered massive miles over the last few years, admittedly, but I plan on changing that. So we've just put 2,000 miles this week on the car, and I'm going to do some more trips with it. And I'm not concerned about the mileage. It's got the old Rover V8, capable of big miles as long as it's properly looked after. And it's a simple old beast. I think it represents fantastic value for money as well. And again, another example of why we don't really need to fear a high mileage car, even when it's something obscure as a Marcos Mantara. So from the GT luxury car of a Jaguar, which, as I've said, you may not be that surprised that it's covered big mileage. I just think it's a great example to show on the channel, and why you shouldn't be worried perhaps about mileage. It's just a small factor in buying a classic car. Don't get hung up on it. Just judge each car for its individual merits. And the Marcos, a hugely sort of obscure car, low production numbers, and perhaps something that you wouldn't expect that has covered over 100,000 miles. But let's go to the more, I suppose, humdrum of classic cars. It's my girlfriend's Mark I Golf Cabriolet. It's a car that we've had for a little while now. She absolutely loves it, so do I. And we've started really pulling this car into daily service at the moment. The sun's out, we get the roof down, and sometimes I'm covering 80, 100 miles a day in this little thing. It's done 146,000 miles, but it's a Golf, so it's really pretty well built. These come from an era where Golfs were capable of this kind of mileage, and this car's been pretty well maintained throughout its years, and it's given no real trouble. We've given it a good annual service, it's had the timing belt changed, and actually I find the more these cars are used, the more not only do you discover about the car and you discover little faults and you just fix them as you go along, but also the cars tend to reward you with the mileage that they do. Things seem to ease off. The car seems to run a little bit sweeter, a little bit better when they're used. They're not just sat around and taken out for short journeys where they get choked up and just not looked after properly. But this is a Mark I Golf. It's capable of big mileage, and this is a testament to great German build quality. It's done this kind of miles that I don't care now if we put another 10, 20, 30,000 miles on it. We're not going to sell it. We're just going to enjoy it for what it is. And it was also a really cheap car, because a lot of people would look at that and go, it's too many miles, I don't want to buy that. Well, we've had great fun with it. We're going to continue to do so. And I'm just glad we've got it. And I couldn't care less that it's done high mileage. I think it's all the better for it. And I think what's always worthy of consideration when you're thinking about buying a classic car is, what are you actually going to do with it? Because the vast majority of people, they will take these cars out on a sunny Sunday afternoon and perhaps go for a little drive of 20, 30 miles in the countryside. It might do the occasional longer journey. So as a general rule, and I am massively generalising here, I think it's probably fair to say that a lot of classics cover small annual mileage. So does it really matter that the car has done 145,000 miles before it enters your ownership? Because you're not going to get in it probably and cover 20,000 miles a year commuting to work in it. And I'm not saying that you can't do that, because you can, but the reality is that most people tend to enjoy these cars as summer toys or just weekend fun toys. So you're not going to rack up big miles. So does it matter? Does it worry? And then we can sort of talk about why you might actually get better value for money with a higher mileage car as well. And I'm not saying, if you take anything home from this video, I'm not saying that you all should buy a car that's done loads of miles. I'm just saying, don't dismiss a classic car because it's done high miles. Look at it and assess that that car might have been loved for years and years and years, cherished, money poured on it whenever it needed it. And that's far better than buying a car that's done half the miles and it's been neglected. So to conclude this video, and I hope it's of some interest to people, I know it's a slightly obscure topic, but as I said, it is something that I get asked an awful lot. And I have seen a lot of people walk away from buying what they think is their dream classic car just because they think the mileage is too high. But let's talk about the value that can come with a high mileage car, because this Golf we bought relatively recently and it's probably worth about £6,500 to £7,000 now. I'm not put off by the miles. Most of these cars have done high mileages because it's a Golf. It's a humdrum car that was used every day for a number of years. It's only really relatively recently it's become a bit of a cult classic, and I still think they're a bargain. But you can pick this car up from as little as £4,000 or £5,000, as I say, about 6.5, 7 for one like this, because it has been very well looked after. But if you were to buy a car, an exact same car that had done half the mileage, you'd pay a significant premium. And I just don't know if that's worth it. And I think the actual case in point for that would be the Jaguar XJS. I think that they are very much a bona fide modern classic. I can't personally remember in my lifetime, but I have my parents and other people tell me of times when E-Type Jaguars were cheap. And I think that's what the era we're in with the XJS, although that is changing. Values of these are rising, and it's very much a desirable classic car now that's very usable. But this XJS has just sold for £7,000. And I think what a bargain the buyer has got. Not only has he got meticulous service history, a car that's very low owners, 3 previous owners. If this car had done half the mileage and perhaps had a sort of sketchy service history, you could expect to pay double for that car. Now, really, is that worth it? Now, that's really up to your own decisions if you're thinking about buying one. But for me, spending another £7,000, so £15,000 in total for a car that arguably is in the same condition, but it's done half the miles, doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I'd rather buy the car that's tried and tested, well loved, cherished, and just use it and enjoy it and not worry. And then you've got the Marcos. Well, it's such an anomaly, as I keep saying. There's a handful of these cars for sale on the market at the moment, and this car may well find a new home at some point, but at the moment I'm just really, really enjoying driving it. And at this kind of mileage, it doesn't need to be precious. As I said, 2,000 miles this week. I'm so confident in this car. I've been using it to commute every day, and I've just absolutely loved it. In fact, I have to say that I've really, really enjoyed driving this car. And when I look at the other ones that are for sale out there at the moment, and there is only 2 or 3, most of them have done sort of 20,000 miles, some of them as low as 5,000 miles. These are usually real toys that do not get out very often. But there's testament that a car like this, there is no reason it can cover big mileage. Even when it approaches 30 years old, you can still enjoy these cars. Value-wise, this is probably one of the cheapest Mantaras out there, should it go on the market. And I don't think there's anything to be fearful of. You can enjoy it, love it, put some miles on it. That's what classic car ownership's all about. So at the complete other end of the spectrum, and this is an area that of car purchasing and classic car purchasing that I really don't understand that much. It's something that I've always tried to shy away from, and it's the ultra low mileage cars that people will, I often see at classic car auctions and things like that, will pay a significant premium for a car that has done no miles or very, very, very low miles. And I often wonder to myself, what do you do with a car like that? Because you've paid a massive premium in order to own it, because it's quite unique, and perhaps that is a big selling point, that you could perhaps be the only person in the world to own a Marcos or a Jaguar that's done 1,000 miles from new or something like that, but you pay the premium for it. And often those cars haven't been used, so they need a great deal of recommissioning before you can actually enjoy the car. And then you start to put miles on the car, and you'll watch the value of that car usually, not always, but usually deplete significantly. And you'll work out all the bugs and the issues of a car that just hasn't been used. The perishing of rubber bushes, fuel lines, brakes seized, engines that just haven't done a lot of work. So as soon as you start kicking everything into action, it throws up a number of faults. It's an area that I just simply don't understand, and I know it's for some people, and I think it's more for the collectors that want to just have a museum piece, and that's absolutely fine. It's a big part of the classic car world. But for me, it's about getting out and enjoying the cars. So I hope that this video has just sort of opened up a little bit of discussion. I'm not here to say that you should buy a car that's done loads of miles, but what I am trying to say is consider a car that's high mileage, as long as it checks out, as long as it's been properly looked after. In a lot of the cases, you don't need to be fearful of that, and it might just be the best way in terms of values that you can get behind the wheel of your dream classic. You can enjoy it, you can use it, and not have to be too precious about it. And believe me, that takes a lot of the sort of worry away from classic car ownership, when you don't need to be precious, when you can just enjoy it for what it is. It's a low entry point in terms of the money that you need to spend to drive it. So I hope it's helped. I hope it's helped. And there'll be plenty more classic car videos on the channel, back to the usual routine of showcasing individual classic cars each week, but also some projects. I've got to give you some updates on the project stuff side of things, and we've got a road trip videos as well coming up. So thanks again. I hope you've enjoyed the video. I hope you haven't thought that I've just ranted on. I'm just trying to show an area that perhaps you might want to consider. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for subscribing, and I'll see you for the next video.